Hey everyone. Today we're going to be taking the Klipsch KG4 speakers that I've been experimenting with to bi-amp with my Sonos Symfonisk, and we're going to finish them up. So I'm going to take all the drivers back out one more time. We're going to brace and add some mass to the cabinets. We are going to add some binding posts, and we're going to tilt them back by cutting down the factory bases that come with these things. So let's get to it. All right, so the first order of business is just getting all the drivers out. This is the horn that I damped down and replaced the diaphragm in, so those are ready to go. And these are the two different kinds of woofers that are in the Klipsch. The lighter ones are the ones that came originally, and the black ones are the replacements. They're both original Klipsch woofers, and they're really hard to come by these days, so I'm going to be stuck with having one of each in each speaker. And this is the passive radiator that comes on it, so it's a large 12-inch model. And one important thing when you take a speaker apart is definitely label everything and keep it organized, because you got to put it all back together again, and the screws are pretty much the same but a little bit different. So looking at the cabinets, you know, they're made okay for the time, but there's no internal bracing, and it looks like they're made from 3/4 inch plywood, and it's not the really thin plywood. So, you know, they sound halfway decent, but there definitely is some resonance going on there with the cabinet. So we're going to see what we can do to brace those up a bit. So that's what they sound like. There's a little bit of ringing. It's not terrible though. So what I decided to do is buy some of this material that they use in car audio. And what this is basically a really high density polymer material, and the idea is that this adds a lot of mass, and if you add mass to the cabinets, it'll keep them from vibrating. So just adding foam to the cabinets or acoustifoam won't reduce the vibrations. Really what you want to do is make them as heavy as possible. And so grabbing these sheets and putting them on the kitchen scale here, you can see how much they weigh. They're about 3/4 pound per sheet. And I got 10 sheets from Amazon here. I think they were like 20 bucks for all 10. And so we're going to put half in each cabinet. So we're going to be adding a decent amount of mass here. And the way it works is there's just a self-adhesive backing. You just peel that away and you put it inside the cabinets. And you have to press down really, really hard to make sure that it actually sticks. I had a few pieces that did fall off originally because I wasn't really going through them and pressing down super, super hard. The other thing I wanted to do is just put a quick brace in here, so I grabbed just a piece of stock here. Reading up on braces, it's interesting. You don't want to put too much pressure on the cabinet because it can actually make the corners release. So what I did is I just went for a friction fit here. So it's just big enough that once I put this silver material on the sides, I can just wedge this in there without it being under too much pressure. So I'm hoping it makes a very small difference here without really stressing out the cabinets. And then after this, we just have to cut the foam that was originally in the cabinet to make room for those braces. And we can reinstall the acoustic foam, and we're back in business. And as you're putting the foam back in, you definitely need to make sure that you don't have it sticking out too much. You don't want it to be rubbing against the drivers and causing any troubles. So just really tuck it in as much as you can into the corners, and that should be that. And as I was looking at this, I started seeing just how bad the cabinets were. There were some really nasty, deep scratches here on the sides. I think that was my fault when I was throwing them around in the garage. So I decided to very, very lightly sand them to try to get some of the worst parts out. So here I'm using very, very fine sandpaper. I think it's 600 grit. You have to be really careful with these cabinets because the veneer is extremely thin. And there were a couple of stains on the top that I really wanted to get further through, but I didn't want to work all the way through the veneer, so I had to leave those. And then what I ended up doing is I just grabbed some clear water-based polyurethane, and I think I did 3 coats on here, and in between each coat I did a little bit of steel wool. And you can even see the stain on the top here. So it's not perfect, but I think in the end they look significantly better, and those really big gouges in the side are a lot less noticeable. So, you know, overall they're as good as they're going to be without really re-veneering these, and the sides look pretty darn good from a distance especially. And in a classic case of, you know, one thing leading to another, I decided to also paint the front and backs while I had the drivers out. So yeah, they were pretty dinged up and just didn't look that great. And so I ended up using some black spray paint. I think I ended up with satin, and I feel like that finish looks pretty good. I ended up doing, I think, 2 or 3 coats here, and in between each coat I used some steel wool to just kind of knock off any of the rough spots. And this makes it look a lot nicer. And you know, once everything's done, it's time for everyone's favorite part of the process, the peeling of the tape. Oh, that's so satisfying. It's a beautiful thing. All right, so with the cabinets in good shape, the next thing I wanted to do is give some attention to the bases on these things. So these have these built-in bases. These to me look super dated. This is like a very 80s look. And so what I figured I could do is really just trim these. So instead of building new bases that are angled to tilt them back, I could just grab a saw and, you know, saw them. So this was an interesting process. This is probably not the best tool. It's all I had on hand. And but they came out okay. I do a little bit of patching because it's not perfectly smooth. But yeah, in the end, it was pretty good. And I ended up painting these first flat black, thinking, hey, that might look kind of cool. But when it dried, not so much. So I went back and repainted them in the same black satin color that I did the front and backs in. And that came up much, much better. And between these, I also did a little bit of light sanding just to make sure everything looks smooth. But I think in the end, this is pretty good. So those are the new bases, didn't cost a thing. And I ended up knocking about half the height off in the back, about a full inch or so. And that gave me what I think is just the right tilt back. So next on my list is to figure out how to wire these up. So let's get rid of these super temporary wires here. And I bought these 6-inch, 3/4 inch thick plywood circles. And I was trying to figure out whether I mount it on the outside or whether I want to mount it inside the cabinet. The inside was probably cleaner, but you could see all the messiness of the cabinet. So in the end, I went with mounting them on the outside of the cabinet. And to make sure that the screw holes for these replacement binding posts lined up with the existing ones, I just grabbed the old Klipsch binding posts and used the 4 screw holes in that as a guide so that I could use the same exact holes in the cabinet. And then the next job was to do a whole bunch of measuring and geometry to get a pair of binding posts centered up in that circle. And once everything was measured, I just drilled it out. And once I got the first one done, I basically just used some clamps to hold them together and use the first one as a guide for the second, so I wouldn't have to measure a second time. And then it was just ready for paint. So I used the same satin black spray paint that I used for the front and back of the cabinets. I did a couple coats there. And then once the paint had fully dried, it was time to wire everything up. So I got a 8-pack of speaker terminals from Amazon, and I basically just threaded them through the holes and wired up some terminals. And one tip is definitely make sure that you mark the back of this so you can keep the woofer and the tweeter and the positive and the negative straight. I might have gotten confused once or twice. And at this stage, then you can just bolt them down to the cabinets, and you can see they do stick out, but they do look pretty nice, I think. So anyway, this is the solution I came up with. It's worth noting that I also did add some foam tape around the outside, so there is a gasket on these, so they're airtight. And speaking of gaskets, there are quite a few drivers that either had really lame gaskets or the gaskets have been lost to the sands of time, or me. So I got a roll of closed cell foam, which is the right kind to use for a gasket. And I just laid it down around all of the drivers here so that we have a really nice airtight seal. The other thing I had to do a little surgery on is this poor black woofer had a pushed in dust cap. And so I tried doing it with just my fingers. That doesn't work. So I ended up very gently using the vacuum cleaner with this attachment, and this works surprisingly well. It's not going to get every little crease out, but this driver looks a million times better now that it's not completely punched in. So this technique does work. This is the oldie but goodie. And so if you do have a pushed in dust cap, give this technique a try. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. All right, so after a couple weekends of work, we're in the home stretch here. So all the front drivers are installed and bolted in. We have our damped cabinets with our brace, the new binding posts. So the last thing to do is just install the passive radiator, screw it down, and we have our finished speakers. And I think the new painted fronts and backs look really great with the drivers installed. So really happy that I went the extra mile there and did the paint work. And the last thing to do here is hook them up. And I wanted to do something a little bit nicer for myself this time. So I bought 4 of these cables, and they're short. I think they're only 6-foot cables, but they have these really nice banana plugs. They're 12 gauge. And so instead of having janky speaker wire, we can have this much cleaner looking pair of wires that plug right into our 5-way binding posts. I don't know why I didn't do this years ago. This is such a nicer way to connect your speakers, especially when you're bi-amping. So you can see what these look like on the back of the speakers. I think they look pretty darn sharp. And you can see how they connect to the Symfoniks in exactly the same way. So those also have these 5-way binding posts on the back. So we can plug these terminals right in like this. It's definitely important to make sure that you don't short anything out as you're doing this. So I had them completely unplugged. And that is the finished product. I am very, very happy with the way this thing looks. So these speakers overall look a million times better and sound really great. I am so happy that I invested the time to really polish these things up. And all the small changes that I made do add up. So making the cabinets better damped, making sure that you have a little bit of bracing in there, and doing things like sealing up any air leaks by adding gaskets. All of those things just clean up the sound overall. So once I ran TruePlay, these things just have such nice, tight, deep bass. There's much less cabinet coloration, and they just sound so dynamic. They're such fun speakers. And you can see the way the angles work. So by trimming those basses, these things lean back just the right amount so that they can get the horns towards your ears. So I really like the way that looks. And I think on the front, the way that the little bit of wood and the bass sit next to each other looks really, really sharp. It doesn't nearly feel as dated as the original wood basses look. So that's the new upgrades on the Klipsch. I'm super happy with these. And the only other thing I'm going to be doing is rebuilding the grills. So I'll do one final video on that. I have some new grill material and badges. And so look for that video coming up in the next couple weeks. Thanks for watching. Bye.